Dr. Sarah Chen pushed her thick glasses up her nose as she stumbled through the grand corridors of the Zephyrian Imperial Palace. The crystalline walls towered above her, casting rainbow reflections that made her squint and adjust her glasses again. She clutched her worn leather satchel tighter, trying not to think about how out of place she looked among the gleaming alien architecture. The peace delegation had been a last-minute addition to her xenobiology research trip. Sarah was supposed to be studying microbial life on distant worlds, not standing in the throne room of the most powerful alien empire in the galaxy. But when the Zephyrian empress personally requested human scientific expertise, Earth's government had scrambled to send their best. Unfortunately, their best was currently hiding behind Ambassador Williams, trying to avoid the piercing golden eyes of Empress Valthara. The Empress stood 12 feet tall, her scales shifting between deep purple and silver as emotions flickered across her reptilian features. Her four arms moved with fluid grace as she gestured to the assembled court, speaking in the melodic Zephyrian language that Sarah's translation implant converted into crisp English. The humans claim their species possesses unique insights into biological adaptation, the Empress said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. We shall see if this proves useful for our current predicament. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had read the briefing materials 3 times during the journey, but the technical details remained frustratingly vague. Something about the Zephyrians losing control over their most important military assets, but the specifics were classified above her security level. Ambassador Williams stepped forward, his diplomatic training evident in his confident posture. Your Imperial Majesty, Dr. Chen represents Earth's finest xenobiological minds. Her research on cross-species neural interfaces has been groundbreaking. Sarah wanted to disappear. Her work involved studying how bacteria communicated, not whatever military problem the Zephyrians were facing. She had only been included because she happened to be the closest human scientist when the Empress made her request. Very well, Empress Valthara said, her golden eyes fixing on Sarah with uncomfortable intensity. Dr. Chen, you will accompany us to the Dragon Sanctuary. Perhaps your human perspective will reveal what our greatest minds have missed. The word dragon made Sarah's scientific curiosity overcome her nervousness. Earth's mythologies spoke of dragons, but seeing actual alien creatures that resembled the legends would be fascinating from a xenobiological standpoint. She nodded eagerly, missing the concerned looks exchanged between the Zephyrian courtiers. The journey to the sanctuary took place in a hover transport that moved through the palace complex with whisper-quiet efficiency. Sarah pressed her face against the transparent walls, marveling at the architecture that seemed to grow from the living rock itself. Everything about Zephyrian culture spoke of ancient wisdom and careful planning, which made their current crisis all the more puzzling. Dr. Chen, the Empress said, settling her massive frame across from Sarah in the transport. What do you know of symbiotic relationships in your research? Sarah blinked, surprised by the direct question. Well, symbiosis is fundamental to life as we understand it, from the bacteria in human digestive systems to the relationship between flowering plants and pollinators. Cooperation between different species often drives evolution forward. And when such relationships break down, usually one or both species suffers, Sarah replied carefully, sometimes catastrophically. Coral bleaching events on Earth show what happens when environmental stress breaks symbiotic bonds that took millions of years to develop. The Empress nodded slowly, her scales shifting to a deeper purple that Sarah's briefing materials had identified as indicating serious concern. Our dragons have served the Zephyrian Empire for over 10,000 years. They are not merely weapons or tools, but partners in our expansion across the stars. 3 months ago, they began refusing our commands. Our greatest dragon, Nethys the Void Render, has not responded to any communication attempts. The others follow her lead. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Military assets that refused orders weren't just a tactical problem. They represented a complete breakdown of whatever system had kept this empire functioning for millennia. Have you tried determining what changed 3 months ago? Environmental factors, diet, social structure changes? Our scientists have examined every possibility, one of the courtiers interjected, speaking for the first time since they left the palace. Nothing has changed in their care, their environment, or their duties. The transport settled onto a landing platform carved from black stone, and Sarah got her first glimpse of the dragon sanctuary. The structure stretched for miles in every direction, with soaring spires that disappeared into the clouds above. But what caught her attention were the massive caves carved into the mountainside, each one sealed with energy barriers that hummed with barely contained power. The barriers are for our protection, not theirs, the Empress explained as they walked toward the main entrance. Dragons are intelligent enough to leave if they choose. The barriers simply ensure they cannot accidentally harm visitors with their enthusiasm. Sarah nodded, though she wondered what kind of enthusiasm required energy barriers rated for military starship shields. Her question was answered when they entered the main observation chamber, and she got her first look at a Zephyrian war dragon. The creature was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Nearly 200 feet long, its body combined the serpentine grace of mythological dragons with technological enhancements that spoke of millions of years of careful breeding and augmentation. Crystalline spines along its back pulsed with energy that Sarah's instruments registered as exotic matter fluctuations. Its 6 limbs ended in claws that could probably cut through starship hulls, and its head bore intelligence that was unmistakably sapient. But what struck Sarah most was how utterly miserable the dragon looked. "That's Vorthak," the Empress said quietly. "One of our younger dragons, only 300 years old. Before the crisis, he was eager to please, always the first to volunteer for missions. Now, the dragon lay curled in the center of its vast chamber, occasionally lifting its head to stare at the energy barrier with what Sarah could only describe as longing. Its movements were listless, lacking the power and grace that the briefing materials had described. "They're depressed," Sarah said without thinking. The Empress and her retinue turned to stare at her. "Explain," the Empress commanded. Sarah adjusted her glasses, her mind racing as she processed what she was seeing. "Depression isn't just a human condition. We've observed it in highly intelligent species across Earth's biosphere. Elephants mourning their dead, dolphins refusing to eat. Primates showing classic signs of clinical depression when separated from their social groups or when their environmental needs aren't met." "But their environment hasn't changed," the courtier protested. "Their emotional environment might have," Sarah replied, pulling out her scanner and taking readings through the energy barrier. "You said they're partners, not just tools. What kind of emotional connection do dragons form with their handlers?" The Empress was quiet for a long moment, her scales shifting through several color patterns Sarah couldn't identify. "Dragons bond for life," she finally said. "Each dragon chooses a single Zephyrian partner when they reach maturity. The bond is profound, deeper than mating, deeper than family. When a dragon's partner dies, the dragon typically follows within a year." Sarah felt pieces clicking together in her mind. 3 months ago? Did something happen to the dragon handlers? A battle? An accident? A disease? The Empress's scales went completely silver, which Sarah's briefing identified as extreme distress. "The Void Plague," she whispered. "It struck without warning, a bioweapon from our enemies that targeted neural tissue. We lost many people, including—" She paused, her 4 arms clenching into fists. including every member of the Dragon Corps. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at the depressed dragon, understanding flooding through her. These weren't military assets refusing orders. They were intelligent beings, grieving the loss of their life partners. "The dragons aren't broken," she said softly. "They're mourning, and forcing them back into service without addressing their grief will likely kill them." "Then what do you suggest?" the Empress asked, her voice carrying a note of desperation that probably hadn't been heard in the imperial court for centuries. Sarah looked at the dragon again, noting how it seemed to perk up slightly when she moved closer to the barrier. "I need to meet them properly, not through barriers and observation chambers, face to face." "Absolutely not," several courtiers said simultaneously. "The safety protocols exist for a reason. Dragons in emotional distress are unpredictable." But the Empress was studying Sarah with new interest. "You believe you can help them?" "I think they need to know that someone understands their loss," Sarah replied. "Grief is a healing process, but it requires acknowledgement and support. If we're going to help them recover, we need to start by treating them as individuals with legitimate emotional needs, not as malfunctioning equipment." The Empress nodded slowly. "Very well, Dr. Chen. Tomorrow you will meet Nethys the Voidrender. If anyone can help us understand what our dragons need, it would be our greatest champion." As they walked back toward the transport, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to step into something far more complex than simple xenobiological research. The dragons weren't just weapons or partners, they were people, in their own way, and they were suffering. Everything in her training told her that helping them heal would require more than scientific analysis. It would require genuine compassion, something she hoped humans could offer even to beings as magnificent and dangerous as the Zephyrian war dragons. The transport ride back to the palace passed in thoughtful silence, but Sarah's mind was already racing with plans. Tomorrow she would meet the greatest dragon in the Zephyrian fleet and somehow find a way to help a being older than human civilization process grief deeper than anything she had ever encountered. She adjusted her glasses one more time and opened her research notes. If she was going to help heal the heart of a dragon, she would need to understand everything about the bonds that had been broken, and perhaps find a way to forge new ones. Sarah spent the night reading everything she could access about dragon-handler relationships. The Zephyrian archives painted a picture of bonds so deep they bordered on telepathic connection. Dragons and their chosen partners shared emotions, thoughts, and even physical sensations through neural links that science still couldn't fully explain. When the handlers died, the dragons hadn't just lost colleagues, they had lost half of themselves. The morning arrived too quickly. Sarah found herself standing before the largest chamber in the dragon sanctuary, her hands shaking as technicians disabled the energy barrier. The space beyond was vast enough to house a small city, carved from living rock and filled with the soft glow of bioluminescent crystals that dragons apparently found soothing. "Nethys has been completely unresponsive for 6 weeks, Dr. Callith, the Zephyrian xenobiologist, explained as they prepared for entry. "She doesn't eat, doesn't acknowledge visitors, doesn't even acknowledge other dragons. We fear she may be entering the final stages of grief decline." Sarah nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The briefing materials described Nethys as 400 feet long and capable of generating void tears that could destroy entire fleets. Meeting such a being while it was in emotional distress seemed like a spectacularly bad idea. "Remember," the Empress said, her golden eyes fixed on Sarah, "Nethys bonded with Commander Thalarix 300 years ago. They never spent more than a day apart in all that time. When the plague took him—" She didn't finish the sentence, but her scales shifted to that silver color of deep distress. The chamber door opened with a sound like distant thunder, and Sarah stepped inside. The ceiling disappeared into shadows above, and the floor was covered with what looked like comfortable sleeping surfaces shaped from crystalline formations. But what dominated the space was Nethys herself. The dragon was even more magnificent than Sarah had imagined. Her scales were deep black that seemed to absorb light, creating the impression of looking into space itself. Void energy crackled along her crystalline spines in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But despite her awesome presence, she lay motionless at the center of the chamber, her massive head resting on her forelimbs like a cat in despair. Sarah walked slowly across the chamber floor, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. She had expected Nethys to react to her presence, but the dragon didn't move. Only when Sarah was close enough to touch the dragon's snout did one massive eye open to regard her. The eye was larger than Sarah's entire torso, a swirling galaxy of silver and gold that held intelligence beyond anything she had ever encountered. For a moment, Sarah felt the weight of centuries of experience and wisdom, followed by a grief so profound it nearly brought her to her knees. "Hello, Nethys," Sarah said softly, settling cross-legged on the floor near the dragon's head. "I'm Sarah. I'm here because I think I understand what you're going through." The dragon's eye focused on her more intently, and Sarah felt a strange sensation in her mind. Not quite telepathy, but something like emotional resonance. She could sense the dragon's surprise at being addressed as an individual rather than interrogated about her military readiness. "I've read about your bond with Commander Thalarix," Sarah continued, pulling off her glasses to clean them nervously. 300 years together. That's longer than my entire species has had written language. I can't imagine what losing him feels like." Nethys made a sound deep in her chest, something between a purr and a sigh. The dragon's massive head shifted slightly, moving closer to Sarah. The movement was careful, deliberate. Despite her grief, Nethys was clearly aware that Sarah was fragile compared to Zephyrian physiology. "Everyone wants you to get better so you can fight again," Sarah said, reaching out tentatively to touch the dragon's snout. The scales were warm and smooth, like polished stone. "But I don't think that's what you need right now. You need someone to acknowledge that what you've lost was real and important." The emotional resonance strengthened, and Sarah gasped as she felt an echo of the dragon's pain. It was like losing a limb, losing a sense, losing half of her soul all at once. Tears ran down her cheeks as she experienced just a fraction of what Nethys was enduring. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, I'm so sorry." Nethys made that sound again, and Sarah felt something shift in the emotional connection. The dragon was surprised, not just by Sarah's empathy, but by the fact that a human could perceive and share her emotional state at all. "I know I can't replace what you've lost," Sarah said, her hand still resting on the dragon's snout. "Nobody could. But maybe you don't have to go through this alone." The dragon's eye closed for a moment, and when it opened again, Sarah felt something like curiosity mixed with the grief. Nethys was studying her, trying to understand this small alien who seemed to grasp concepts that even other dragons had struggled with. "Your people are worried about you," Sarah continued. "They don't understand what you need because they're thinking like military commanders instead of like friends. They see broken weapons instead of broken hearts." Nethys shifted, raising her head slightly to get a better look at Sarah. The movement caused void energy to crackle along her spines. But it felt controlled rather than threatening. For the first time since entering the chamber, Sarah began to hope that communication was possible. "Can I tell you about humans?" she asked. "We're not as old as dragons, not as wise, not as powerful, but we understand grief, we understand loss, and we've learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means finding a way to carry love forward even when the person you love is gone." The dragon made a new sound, something like a question. Sarah felt the emotional resonance shift again, and suddenly she was experiencing flashes of memory that weren't her own. Flying through space with Thalorix, feeling the joy of perfect synchronization as they danced between asteroids, the quiet contentment of resting together between missions, the fierce protectiveness they shared when defending their people. And then, the memories turned dark. Thalorix collapsing as the plague attacked his nervous system, Nethys trying desperately to maintain their neural link as her partner slipped away. The moment when the connection went silent forever. Sarah sobbed openly, overwhelmed by the intensity of the dragon's memories. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she pressed closer to Nethys, offering what comfort she could through touch and presence. "He loved you so much," she whispered. "I can feel it. That kind of love doesn't just disappear because someone dies. It becomes part of who you are." Nethys made a sound of pure anguish, a keening wail that echoed through the chamber and probably carried throughout the entire sanctuary. But there was something else in the sound. Recognition, perhaps even relief. Someone finally understood. They sat together in silence for a long time, Sarah's hand on the dragon's snout, while Nethys processed emotions she had been carrying alone for months. Gradually, the emotional resonance settled into something calmer, though the grief remained. "I know you don't want to fight anymore," Sarah said eventually. "Fighting was something you did with Thalorix. Without him, it probably feels wrong, like betraying his memory." The dragon's eye opened again, fixing on Sarah with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. In the emotional connection, Sarah felt confirmation of her guess, along with something like amazement that this tiny alien understood concepts that had eluded the Empress's advisors for months. But what if... Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. What if fighting could be a way of honoring him instead of betraying him? Not fighting because someone orders you to, but fighting to protect the things you both cared about. Nethys was very still, considering this idea. Through their connection, Sarah could feel the dragon turning the concept over in her mind, examining it from different angles. "Your people are going to face their enemies again," Sarah continued. "The ones who created the plague that killed Thalorix and the other handlers. If you and the other dragons don't fight, more people will die. More bonds will be broken." The void energy along Nethys's spines began to pulse in a different pattern, more regular and controlled. Sarah felt the dragon's thinking shift, moving from pure grief towards something more complex. Purpose, perhaps. Direction. "I can't replace Thalorix," Sarah said, "but maybe I can help you find a new way to fly. Not as a weapon following orders, but as a guardian protecting the things that matter." Nethys raised her head fully for the first time since Sarah had entered the chamber. The movement was fluid and powerful, reminding Sarah that despite her grief, this was still the most formidable military asset in the known galaxy. But the dragon's attention remained focused on Sarah, and through their connection, she felt something like hope beginning to grow. "Would you like to try flying again?" Sarah asked. "Just to see how it feels?" The dragon's response came not in words or sounds, but as a direct emotional transmission that hit Sarah like a warm wave. Agreement, curiosity, and underneath it all, a tentative trust in this small human who had somehow found the key to her healing. Nethys rose to her feet with movements that spoke of barely contained power. Sarah stood as well, suddenly aware that she was standing next to a being capable of tearing holes in reality itself. But she wasn't afraid. The emotional connection between them had created a bond of trust that transcended species barriers. "Together?" Sarah asked, reaching out her hand. Nethys lowered her massive head, gently bumping her snout against Sarah's palm in what could only be described as a nuzzle. In that moment, both of them felt something new being born. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but something entirely different. A partnership based not on neural links or ancient traditions, but on mutual understanding and choice. Outside the chamber, alarms began to sound as monitoring systems detected that Nethys was moving for the first time in weeks. But Sarah barely heard them. She was too busy marveling at the impossible connection forming between a grieving dragon and a nervous human scientist who had somehow stumbled into the role of interspecies therapist. The throne room erupted in chaos when Nethys emerged from the sanctuary with Sarah riding on her head. Courtiers scattered as the massive dragon moved with fluid grace through corridors that had never been designed for her passage. Energy barriers sparked and failed as Nethys simply passed through them, her void powers making physical obstacles irrelevant. Empress Valthara stood frozen on her throne, watching in stunned silence as her greatest dragon approached with the human scientist perched between her horns like the most unlikely dragon rider in galactic history. Sarah clung to the crystalline spines, trying to look confident while internally marveling at the impossibility of her situation. "Your Imperial Majesty!" Sarah called out as Nethys settled into a resting position that still left her towering over everyone in the room. "I think we've figured out what the dragons need." The Empress descended from her throne slowly, her scales cycling through colors that indicated profound shock and confusion. "Dr. Chen, how did you—" She paused, studying the relaxed posture of her previously despondent dragon. "Nethys has not left her chamber in 2 months. She has not responded to any communication attempts, and now she follows you like a bonded partner," Sarah finished, sliding down from Nethys's head with less grace than she would have preferred, but not the same kind of bond she had with Commander Thalarix. Something new. The dragon made a low rumbling sound that somehow conveyed agreement and contentment. Through their connection, Sarah could feel Nethys's emotions stabilizing for the first time since the plague. The grief remained, but it was no longer the crushing weight that had paralyzed her. It had become something bearable, integrated into a new sense of purpose. "Explain," the Empress commanded, though her tone held wonder rather than authority. Sarah adjusted her glasses, gathering her thoughts. "The dragons aren't broken military assets. They're intelligent beings who lost their life partners. Trying to force them back into service without addressing their grief was like asking someone to dance immediately after losing their legs. It's not that they won't. It's that they can't, not without healing first." Dr. B. Kaleth stepped forward, his scientific curiosity overriding his shock. "But the neural bonds were irreplaceable. Dragons mate for life, bond for life. There should be no mechanism for forming new partnerships." "There isn't," Sarah agreed. "At least not the same kind of partnership. But intelligent beings are adaptable. When traditional bonds become impossible, new forms of connection can develop. Nethys and I don't share a neural link, but we have something else. Mutual understanding, shared purpose, and most importantly, choice." Nethys lowered her head to nuzzle Sarah's shoulder gently, and the gesture sent murmurs through the assembled court. The dragon's void energy was completely stable, her movements controlled and purposeful. Whatever had changed between her and the human, it had clearly restored her emotional equilibrium. "The key was treating her as an individual with legitimate needs," Sarah continued. "Not as equipment to be repaired, but as a person dealing with traumatic loss. Humans understand grief because we're short-lived compared to dragons. We've had to develop ways to process loss and find meaning after tragedy." The Empress approached slowly, her golden eyes fixed on Nethys. "My old friend," she said softly in Zephyrian, "you look yourself again." Nethys responded with a complex series of vocalizations that Sarah's translator couldn't parse, but the emotional resonance she shared with the dragon conveyed respect, affection, and determination. Nethys was explaining her choice, her decision to bond with the human who had understood her grief and offered a path forward. "The other dragons," the Empress said, turning back to Sarah. Can this healing be replicated? Sarah considered the question carefully. Each dragon will need individual attention. Their grief is personal, tied to specific relationships and memories. But yes, I think they can all find new purpose. The process just requires patience and respect for what they've been through. Over the following weeks, Sarah worked with each of the surviving dragons. Some, like young Vorthak, responded quickly to compassionate attention and the promise of protecting others from similar loss. Others required more time and careful emotional support before they could move beyond their paralysis. But the real test came when enemy forces arrived at the edge of Zephyrian space. The Kethmori Empire had been watching for signs of weakness, and the sudden silence of the dragon fleet had convinced them that the time was right for a decisive strike. Their invasion force consisted of 300 warships armed with the same bioweapons that had created the plague. Sarah stood on the bridge of the Zephyrian flagship, watching the enemy fleet approach through the viewport. Around her, military commanders prepared for a battle they weren't sure they could win without their dragon support. The conventional fleet was formidable, but dragons had been the cornerstone of Zephyrian military supremacy for millennia. "The enemy will be in firing range in 20 minutes, the fleet commander reported. "Should we begin evacuation of civilian sectors?" Empress Vilthera stood silent, weighing options that all seemed to lead to massive casualties. Then the communication system activated, and Nethys's voice filled the bridge with harmonics that conveyed both grief and determination. "We fly for those who cannot fly," the dragon said, her words carrying through the mental connection she now shared with Sarah. "We fight for bonds that will not be broken again." Through the viewport, Sarah watched as Nethys emerged from the flagship's Dragon Bay, her void powers creating tiers in space that allowed her to move between dimensions. Behind her came the other dragons, each one carrying a human partner who had helped them process their grief and find new purpose. The dragons had chosen their new bonds carefully. Vorthak flew with Dr. Martinez, a trauma counselor who understood recovery from loss. Silthan had bonded with Captain Torres, a tactical officer whose strategic mind complemented the dragon's aggressive instincts. Each partnership was unique, built on compatibility and mutual choice rather than ancient traditions. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. The dragons fought not as weapons following orders, but as individuals protecting something precious. Their tactics were fluid and innovative, combining their natural abilities with human creativity and adaptability. Sarah felt every moment of the combat through her connection with Nethys. The dragon's void powers tore through enemy formations, while her human partner provided strategic coordination and emotional support. It was a dance of destruction and protection that honored both the fallen handlers and the new partnerships that had risen from grief. When the enemy fleet retreated in disarray, the Zephyrian Empire had not only survived, but discovered a new model for cooperation between species. The dragons had not just healed from their trauma, they had evolved beyond their previous limitations. In the aftermath, as reports came in of enemy forces surrendering throughout their territory, the Empress summoned Sarah to the throne room once more. Nethys coiled around the chamber, no longer the broken creature she had been months earlier, but a being reborn through the power of understanding and choice. "Dr. Chen," the Empress said, her scales showing colors that indicated deep respect. "Your species has given us something we did not know we needed. Not just the return of our dragon fleet, but a new understanding of partnership itself." Sarah smiled, reaching up to touch Nethys's snout as the dragon lowered her head affectionately. "Humans are good at adapting to loss. We've had to be. But what we discovered here is that healing doesn't require forgetting the past. It requires building something meaningful from what remains." The dragon made a sound of agreement, and through their bond, Sarah felt contentment that had nothing to do with military victory. Nethys had found a way to carry her love for Thalarix forward while embracing a new partnership built on choice and understanding. As the weeks turned to months, the human-dragon partnerships became the foundation for a new era of cooperation between species. The bonds they had forged in grief and healing proved stronger and more flexible than the traditional neural links, capable of adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining their emotional core. Sarah kept her position as chief xenobiological advisor, but her real role was something entirely new. A bridge between species who had learned that understanding could transcend even the deepest differences. And whenever she flew with Nethys through the void between stars, she marveled at how the universe's most powerful weapon had chosen to follow a nerdy human girl simply because she had offered something no technology could provide: genuine compassion for a grieving heart. The alien empress was no longer stunned by her dragon's choice. She understood now that the greatest bonds were not those imposed by tradition or necessity, but those freely chosen by beings who recognized in each other the potential for something greater than either could achieve alone.